Hi, my name is Greg Bach, and this is a summary of part one of David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. And as you start reading, you'll realize that this doesn't read like a normal philosophy book. It's a dialogue between these different characters, and so it reads more like a play or a piece of fiction. So the first question that should come to your mind is why is it written in this way? And there are several possibilities. We don't know for sure, but there are several possibilities. One might be that David Hume wants to remain anonymous, in the sense of he doesn't want people to know his actual views on it. So he might put his views in the mouth of one of these characters or all of them. So that's one way to remain anonymous. And he might want to do that because he fears the criticism or he fears the persecution that might come with his own views. He might also write in this format because he wants to just show the reader the variety of perspectives out there and allow the reader to invite the reader into the conversation and decide for themselves what they think about it. So there's a number of reasons why he might be writing this way. Scholars think, though, that the character Philo in the dialogue is closest to David Hume's views because Philo is a skeptic, and David Hume himself is a skeptic. Nevertheless, the other two characters are painted in a somewhat favorable light, and so perhaps some of the things that you find them expressing may also be views that David Hume thinks at least deserve some credit. So, with that, we begin. And you see in the very first lines, Demia is expressing his philosophy of education, and he says, quote, "The students of philosophy ought first to learn logics, then ethics, next physics, and last of all, the nature of the gods." And when we're talking about nature of the gods, he's talking about theology. Philo is quick to point out here, however, this is concerning to him. Why would you leave theology or religion to the very end of one's education? Don't you want to start them off with good moral principles and good religious principles before you get to anything else? And Demia responds to correct the misunderstanding that he's communicated to Philo by saying, "Oh, I didn't mean I was not going to train them up in those kinds of things. My students are definitely going to get what he calls an education in piety early on, and piety is just the term here for this religious training, right? They are going to get training in piety. What he means to put off until later is the human theology, the endless debates, what he calls the arrogance of philosophy, where you have uh, philosophers and theologians who think they understand more than they do, that they can capture more about God and reality than the human mind actually is able to. And so Philo agrees with this. He thinks this is a great strategy. He says, quote, in his response, he says, quote, "Let Demia's principles be improved and cultivated. Let us become thoroughly sensible of the weakness, blindness, and narrow limits of human reason." And so here he stresses the limits of reason, and so he is expressing a type of skepticism. What type remains to be seen as we move forward, but it is a type of skepticism, at least one that talks about the limits of reason. Now, the next character, Cleanthes, has been listening in on this and is concerned about this skepticism. And he says, in response, quote, you propose then, Philo, to erect religious faith on philosophical skepticism? So he thinks that Philo is still going to be defending religion, but nevertheless try to do it with this type of skepticism. So he takes a few jabs at Philo here. He says, when we'll see if you're a true skeptic. When this conversation ends, are you going to go out through the door or the window? In other words, do you believe in gravity? Right? Do you believe that the laws of nature actually apply to you? And he thinks, yeah, you certainly do, because you're going to probably go out the door, just like the rest of us do. But that's just going to show us that you're not a true skeptic, that you might pretend to be a skeptic when you engage in philosophy and talk about these things, But when it comes down to everyday living, about real things, he says these external objects press in upon you. The reality of the world presses in upon you, and then you have to leave your skepticism behind and join the rest of us. So Philo says, actually, he corrects Cleanthes and says, actually, I'm not a skeptic about everything. When it comes to life, I will live life like everybody else. I will follow the rules like everybody else. And being a philosopher, or thinking carefully like a philosopher, is better, because then about these things you're going to be more correct than other people. So Philo wants to limit his skepticism only to religious matters. So when it comes to everyday things, he's not going to be skeptical about things like the laws of nature. But when it comes to the afterlife or the supernatural, he thinks it's right to be skeptical about any claims that someone might make, because these matters are, quote, too large for our grasp. Cleanthes responds, but you accept evidence and reason in every other area, in every other realm. You accept these deliverances of reason. When it comes to science, these things are very heady and very complicated, and yet you don't reject, say, the theories of Copernicus or Galileo. You accept them. And so by that reasoning, you should also accept even more straightforward teachings that come out of religion. Cleanthes identifies two types of skepticism. The first type is called brutish and ignorant. He thinks this is the type of skepticism that's just had by simple people who aren't really that educated and who reject knowledge of things that they just don't understand. So they'll reject the sciences, they'll reject the complicated matters of physics and mathematics just because it's too hard for them to understand. So they just don't believe them. He doesn't think that Philo is this type. He thinks that Philo falls into the second type, and that is the refined and philosophical skeptic, the one who carefully follows the evidence and reason and philosophy and science, but for some strange reason, when it comes to religion, they deny knowledge. He says, quote, "This is their practice in all natural, mathematical, moral, and political science, and why not the same, I ask, in the theological and religious? Why must conclusions of this nature be alone rejected on the general presumption of the insufficiency of human reason, without any particular discussion of the evidence? Is not such an unequal conduct a plain proof of prejudice and passion?" So he calls it prejudice and passion. He's just really criticizing Philo for being inconsistent here. He's being unfair to religion. So he says that being a skeptic is impossible in practice, and he says his own watching Philo's own behavior refutes this position, refutes himself. It's self-refuting, basically, is what he's saying. Cleanthes wraps up the dialogue by saying that nowadays, at least since Locke, religion is based on reason, and that the evidence supports religion. And so I hope that's helpful in understanding part one of the dialogues.